The church was packed, the flowers were wilting, and the groom was gone. Nora stood at the altar in a gown that suddenly felt like a heavy, suffocating shroud, listening to the murmurs of London's elite dissecting her absolute ruin. Richard had fled. The man she thought she loved was a coward. But it wasn't Richard who stepped out from the front pew, silencing the cruel whispers. It was his older brother, the Duke, cold, untouchable, and he was holding out his hand. 2:00 came and went, then 2:15, then 2:30. The air inside St. Jude's was thick, smelling heavily of melting beeswax candles, crushed lilies, and the collective body heat of 400 aristocrats waiting for a spectacle. Nora stood at the front of the nave. Her back was perfectly straight. Her jaw ached from clamping her teeth together. She did not turn around. She didn't need to. The silence behind her had long since fractured, replaced by the rustle of silk and the sharp, acidic whispers of the ton. They were watching a girl drown, and they were thoroughly enjoying the view. Beside her, her father was sweating through his wool coat. He gripped the polished wood of the front pew until his knuckles strained white against his skin. Nora's family, the Linfields, had exactly two things left to their name: an ancient title and crippling debt. Richard, the charming, golden-haired second son of the Duke of Westmore, had been their salvation. He had courted Nora with sonnets, with impulsive dances at midnight, with promises of a sprawling life on the continent. He had not, however, shown up to marry her. The heavy oak doors at the back of the church groaned open. A collective intake of breath sucked the oxygen from the room. Nora allowed herself a fraction of a glance. It was a messenger boy. He hurried down the center aisle, his boots clapping loudly against the stone, looking terrified. He handed a folded piece of parchment to the vicar. The vicar read it. His face drained of color. He looked at Nora's father. Nora didn't need to read the ink. She knew. "He's gone," her father choked out, his voice a pathetic, broken wheeze. "He's boarded a ship to Calais. He says he is not ready." Nora stared at the altar cross. A cold, nauseating weight dropped into her stomach. She wasn't just left, she was discarded. By tomorrow, she would be a pariah. By next month, the creditors would seize their estate. The corset binding her ribs felt like iron. She wanted to scream, to tear the veil from her hair, to sink to the floor and disappear. But Nora had too much pride for a public breakdown. She kept her chin raised. She took a slow, agonizing breath, preparing to turn around and face the vultures. A heavy, measured footfall sounded on the stone. It wasn't the frantic scurry of the messenger, nor the hesitant shuffle of her father. It was a deliberate, authoritative sound. Nora turned her head. Alistair, the Duke of Westmore, Richard's older brother. He was everything Richard was not. Where Richard was fair and laughing, Alistair was dark, severe, and eternally unamused. He wore a coat of stark, impeccable black. His face was a mask of sharp angles and ruthless composure. Society feared him. He rarely attended balls, never gambled, and spoke only when necessary. He stopped in front of the vicar. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Nora's father, who was currently trembling like a leaf. He looked directly at Nora. His eyes were a flat, unreadable grey. "My brother is a fool," Alistair said. His voice was low, but it carried a natural resonance that instantly killed the whispers in the pews behind them. "He has disgraced my house, and he has insulted yours." Nora held his gaze. "He has ruined me, Your Grace." She didn't say it with pity. She said it like a fact. Alistair's jaw shifted. A tiny, almost imperceptible flecks of muscle beneath his skin. "I do not tolerate debts tied to my name, nor do I tolerate public spectacles." He turned his head slightly, addressing the vicar, though his eyes never left Nora's. Change the names on the registry." The vicar blinked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Your Grace?" Change the name from Richard to Alistair. The dowry stands. The settlements remain identical. The ceremony will proceed." A gasp rippled through the front pews. Nora's father let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Nora stared at the towering man before her. A duke, the absolute pinnacle of the peerage, offering to marry a ruined, debt-ridden bride simply to clean up his brother's mess. It was entirely unromantic. It was a business transaction finalized over the corpse of her shattered heart. "You do not have to do this," Nora whispered, the words meant only for him. "I am not your responsibility. You are now," Alistair replied evenly. He stripped off his right glove, exposing a large, calloused hand, and held it out to her. "Will you take my hand, Nora, or will you walk out those doors alone?" It was a brutal, cynical choice. Starve in the gutter with her pride, or bind herself to a man made of ice to survive. Nora looked at his outstretched hand. It didn't tremble. It was a rock in the middle of a raging storm. Slowly, her fingers numb, Nora reached out. His grip was firm, unexpectedly warm and solid. He pulled her a half-step closer to the altar, shielding her entirely from the stares of the crowd with his broad shoulders. "Proceed," Alistair ordered the vicar. And just like that, Nora's life was signed away to a stranger. The ceremony was agonizingly fast. The vicar spoke with the hurried, breathless cadence of a man terrified the Duke might change his mind. Nora heard the words as if underwater. To have and to hold, in sickness and in health. She had practiced these vows in her mirror. She had imagined saying them to a man who smiled at her, a man who promised her the world. Instead, she was saying them to a man who stared straight ahead, his profile cut from granite. When it came time for the ring, there was a brief, awkward pause. Richard had taken the wedding band with him. Alistair didn't miss a beat. He reached to his left hand and pulled the heavy gold signet ring from his pinky finger. He took Nora's trembling left hand. His thumbs were slightly rough against her soft skin. He slid the heavy gold band onto her ring finger. It was far too large, hanging loose around her knuckle. Before it could slip off, Alistair closed her fingers into a gentle fist, holding her hand firmly within his own until the vicar declared them man and wife. There was no kiss. Alistair simply offered his arm. Nora took it. They turned and walked down the aisle. The sea of faces was a blur of shock, envy, and confusion. Nora kept her eyes fixed on the heavy oak doors at the end of the nave. Alistair's stride was long, but he deliberately slowed his pace to match hers, ensuring she didn't trip over the heavy train of her gown. They emerged into the overcast London afternoon. The damp air hit Nora's face, a sudden sharp relief from the suffocating incense. A sprawling black carriage bearing the ducal crest waited at the curb. The footman snapped to attention, pulling the door open. Alistair handed her inside. Nora sank into the plush leather squabs. The door clicked shut, sealing them in dim, quiet isolation. A moment later, the carriage lurched forward. Silence descended. It was heavy, suffocating. Nora sat strictly on her side of the carriage, staring at her lap. The massive gold signet ring weighed her hand down. The adrenaline that had carried her through the church was evaporating, leaving behind a raw, hollow ache. Richard was gone. He had never loved her. It was all a game to him. And now she was locked in a carriage with the most intimidating man in England, bound to him until death. A single tear betrayed her, slipping down her cheek. She angrily wiped it away, smudging her powder. She hated herself for crying. She hated Richard for running. Most of all, she hated the utter indignity of being a charity case. She expected Alistair to ignore her, or worse, to offer some stiff, patriarchal lecture on duty and composure. Instead, a crisp, white linen handkerchief appeared in her peripheral vision. Nora looked up. Alistair wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed resolutely out the window at the passing cobblestones. His arm was simply extended across the space between them, holding the cloth. She took it. "Thank you." Her voice was raspy, broken. He didn't reply. The carriage rattled over a deep rut in the road. The jolt sent a sharp draft of cold autumn air whistling through a tiny gap in the window frame. Nora shivered, the thin silk of her wedding dress offering no protection. Alistair shifted. Without a word, he unfastened the heavy wool travelling cloak from his own shoulders. He leaned across the carriage. Nora tensed, shrinking back into the leather. Alistair paused. He didn't touch her. He simply draped the massive, heavy cloak over her lap and shoulders, tucking the edges around her to block the draft. The wool was imbued with his scent: cedarwood, saddle leather, and rain. It was startlingly warm. Having ensured she was covered, he sat back against his seat, crossing his long legs, entirely unbothered by the sudden chill in his own attire. "We will not reside in London," Alistair said suddenly. His voice broke the quiet, startling her. It was the first time he had spoken since the altar. "The gossips will feast on this for a month. I have no interest in entertaining them. We are going straight to Ashbourne." Ashbourne, his ancestral estate in the north. It was famously isolated. "Very well," Nora said. What else could she say? She was his property now. "You will need a new wardrobe," he continued, his tone purely analytical. "Your current dresses are designed for London drawing rooms. Ashbourne is cold. I will send for a modiste upon our arrival." Nora looked down at the heavy ring on her thumb. "You do not need to spend your money on me, Your Grace. You have already bought my family's debts. That is payment enough for whatever this is." Alistair finally turned his head from the window. His grey eyes locked onto hers. The intensity in them made Nora's breath catch. "You are my wife, Nora," he said, his voice dropping a register, losing its businesslike clip. "You are the Duchess of Westmore. You will not wear rags, and you will not speak of yourself as a purchased commodity. Not to me, not to anyone." Nora stared at him, taken aback by the sudden fierce edge in his voice. "I am a convenience, a patch over your brother's mistake." Alistair held her gaze for a long moment. He looked as though he wanted to say something. His jaw tightened, but whatever words sat on his tongue, he swallowed them. He turned back to the window. "Rest," was all he said. "It is a long journey." Nora pulled his heavy cloak tighter around her shoulders, burying her face in the thick wool. For the first time that day, the biting cold in her chest began to thaw. They travelled for 2 days. The journey was a blur of roadside inns, rain-lashed windows, and a quiet so profound it felt physical. Alistair was a man of ruthless efficiency. He handled the innkeepers, the ostlers, and the meals with sharp, clipped commands. He ensured Nora had hot water, fresh tea, and a private room each night. But he never lingered to share them. By the time the carriage finally turned onto the long, sweeping drive of Ashbourne, dusk had fallen, bringing with it a driving, relentless rain. Nora peered through the water-streaked glass. The estate was massive, a sprawling fortress of grey stone rising aggressively against the bruised sky. It looked exactly like its master, imposing, ancient, and entirely unwelcoming. The carriage rolled to a halt beneath the portico. Instantly, a small army of servants spilled from the massive front doors, carrying umbrellas and lanterns. Alistair stepped out first into the downpour. He didn't wait for a footman. He snapped an umbrella open himself and turned back to the carriage, offering his hand. Nora took it, stepping down into the cold night. Alistair instantly pulled her close to his side, angling the umbrella perfectly so that not a single drop of rain touched her silk dress, while the left side of his own coat was instantly soaked. They walked into the grand foyer. It was cavernous, with floors of black and white marble and sweeping dual staircases. A severe-looking woman in a black bombazine dress stood at the head of the servant line. "Welcome home, Your Grace," she said, dipping into a deep curtsy. "Mrs. Croft?" Alistair nodded. "This is the Duchess." Mrs. Croft blinked. Her eyes darted to Nora's damp, wrinkled wedding dress, then to the oversized signet ring dangling from her thumb. If she was shocked to see her master return married, and married to the girl his brother was supposed to wed, she masked it well. "Welcome to Ashbourne, Your Grace," the housekeeper said evenly. "Her Grace is exhausted," Alistair said, stripping off his wet gloves and tossing them onto a silver tray. "Show her to her chambers. Have a hot bath drawn immediately." "Right away, Your Grace. The guest chambers in the East Wing are—" "Not the guest chambers," Alistair interrupted. His voice was sharp. "The Duchess's suite." Mrs. Croft paused, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing her stoic face. "But, Your Grace, the suite has been closed since your mother passed. It is under dust covers. It hasn't been aired." "Then air it out," Alistair commanded, already turning toward his study. "Put every maid in the house on it if you must. She sleeps there tonight." He didn't look back at Nora. He simply walked down the long, shadowed corridor, the heavy thud of his boots echoing against the stone walls until a door clicked shut, leaving her alone with a row of staring servants. An hour later, Nora stood in the center of the Duchess's suite. It was a magnificent room, far larger than her entire family home in London. The dust covers had been hastily stripped away, revealing deep velvet curtains and heavily carved mahogany furniture. A massive fire was roaring in the hearth, violently fighting off the damp chill of the stone. Nora was exhausted. Her bones ached. She felt numb, a ghost haunting a stranger's house. A maid scurried in, carrying a silver tea tray. "For you, Your Grace. The Duke insisted it be brought up before your bath." "Thank you," Nora murmured, walking over to the small table by the fire. She expected the standard, weak Earl Grey that servants usually pushed on tired guests. Instead, as she poured the steaming liquid into a porcelain cup, the rich, smoky aroma of lapsang souchongs hit her nose. Nora froze. Lapsang souchong was rare, it was expensive, and it was her absolute favorite. She stared at the dark liquid. Richard had always teased her for drinking it, calling it mud water. He had constantly ordered her chamomile instead, completely ignoring her preferences. How did the kitchen at Ashbourne know? Frowning, Nora picked up her cup and walked toward the massive four-poster bed. A small stack of books rested on the bedside table. She set her tea down and picked up the top volume. It was a worn, leather-bound copy of The Odyssey, translated into English. Beneath it was a volume on the botany of the Scottish Highlands. Beneath that, a collection of cynical political essays by a controversial French philosopher. Nora's breath hitched. 6 months ago, at a dreadful ball in Mayfair, she had been trapped in a corner by a boasting lord. She had desperately tried to steer the conversation, mentioning her love for Homer, her quiet fascination with wild flora, and her secret agreement with radical French politics. Richard had laughed loudly, patted her hand, and told her not to trouble her pretty head with such heavy topics. She had thought no one else was listening. She looked back at the door. She looked at the smoky tea. She looked at the specific, carefully chosen books resting on her nightstand. Alistair had been at that ball. He had been standing by the far wall, nursing a brandy, looking thoroughly bored. He hadn't spoken to her that night. He had barely looked at her. Yet somehow he had heard her. Nora slowly sat on the edge of the mattress, the heavy gold ring slipping slightly on her finger. The narrative she had built in her head, the cold, unfeeling Duke who had bought her like a piece of broken furniture to save his family's pride, began to crack. He was ruthless, yes. He was distant. But as Nora held the warm teacup between her palms, a strange, terrifying realization washed over her. Richard had never known her at all, but his silent, terrifying brother was paying attention. Morning in Ashbourne did not break. It bled slowly through the heavy leaded windows, a pale, watery grey that barely chased the shadows from the corners of the Duchess's suite. Nora woke to the crackle of a freshly stoked fire. She lay perfectly still in the massive, unfamiliar bed. The linen smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. For a fleeting, merciful second, her mind was blank. Then the weight of the gold ring on her thumb slipped, dragging her back to reality. She was a wife, she was a duchess, she was abandoned. She pushed the heavy covers aside and walked to the window. The estate ground stretched out beneath her, a vast, rugged expanse of wild moors and dark, dense forest, currently being lashed by a persistent drizzle. It was brutal and bleak. It felt entirely appropriate. A soft knock broke her reverie. A maid entered, bobbing a quick curtsy, followed by Mrs. Croft. Behind them, 2 footmen hauled a pair of massive brass-bound trunks into the room. "Good morning, Your Grace," Mrs. Croft said, her voice a flat, efficient clip. "The Duke sent for Madame Aris from York late last night. She arrived an hour ago. She has brought her existing stock, as well as bolts for immediate tailoring." Nora frowned. "He sent a rider in that storm?" "His Grace is not a man who delays, ma'am." Nora allowed herself to be dressed in one of her old, pale muslin gowns, a dress built for heated London drawing rooms. She shivered as the damp chill of the stone walls bit right through the thin fabric. Madame Aris was a small, sharp-eyed woman who took one look at Nora's trembling shoulders and immediately began barking orders in rapid French to her assistants. Trunks were thrown open. Bolts of fabric tumbled across the Persian rug. Nora stood passively as measuring tapes were wrapped around her waist, her arms, her throat. She expected the usual barrage of questions. Did she prefer pink or peach? Did she want lace or ribbons? Richard had loved her in pale pinks and sky blues. He had once told her she looked like a spun sugar confection, a compliment that had secretly made her feel vaguely nauseous. "The Duke was very specific about the materials," Madame Aris muttered around a mouthful of pins, wrapping a heavy swatch of dark, forest green velvet around Nora's shoulders. Nora looked down. "He was?" "Oh, yes. No silks, no organza. Only heavy wools, cashmeres, and thick velvets. He stated that northern winters are unforgiving, and you are prone to taking chills." The dressmaker paused, pulling a dark sapphire wool from the pile. "He also forbade pastels, said they would wash you out. He ordered deep greens, navy, claret, and charcoal." Nora stared at her reflection in the full-length cheval glass. The rich, dark green velvet against her skin did not make her look like a confection. It made her look striking, grounded, real. How did he know I was prone to chills? She thought back to a carriage ride 3 months ago, a brief open-air excursion in Hyde Park. She had forgotten her shawl. Richard had been too busy waving to his acquaintances to notice her shivering. Alistair had been riding alongside them on a massive black gelding. He had merely glanced at her, turned his horse, and ridden away. 10 minutes later, a footman had approached the carriage and handed her a thick woolen blanket. She had assumed her mother sent it. Nora closed her eyes. The ache in her chest twisted, shifting from the sharp sting of betrayal to a dull, heavy confusion. Once the dressmaker left to begin her frantic stitching, Nora ventured out of her suite. Ashbourne was a labyrinth of dark oak panelling, faded tapestries, and severe portraits of long-dead dukes. The house was utterly silent, save for the distant ticking of a grandfather clock. She found Alistair in the library. The room was vast, smelling of old paper, leather, and dog. A massive Irish wolfhound lay stretched out before the hearth. Alistair sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk, his cravat discarded, his white linen shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He was surrounded by towering stacks of ledgers. He didn't look up when she entered. He just kept scratching a quill across the parchment. "You are awake," he noted. His voice was gravelly, tired. "It is nearly noon, Your Grace." "Alistair," he corrected, turning a page. "If you call me Your Grace when we are alone, I will assume you are mocking me." Nora stepped further into the room. The hound cracked one eye open, thumped its tail once against the rug, and went back to sleep. I saw the dressmaker, Nora said. Good. The climate here is not suited for London gauze. You chose the colours. Alistair's hand paused. The quill hovered over the inkwell. He finally looked up. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his grey eyes. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. I did. Do you object? No. Nora crossed her arms over her chest, rubbing her arms through the useless muslin of her current dress. I simply wonder when you had the time to notice what colours suit me. Alistair held her gaze for a long, silent moment. The air in the library suddenly felt very thick. He set the quill down. You are my brother's former fiancé, he said slowly, deliberately. It would have been impossible not to notice you. It was an evasion. A neat, perfectly logical evasion. Nora didn't push it. She walked closer to the desk, her eyes scanning the massive piles of paper. What are you doing? She asked. Cleaning up. Alistair leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand roughly over his jaw. A shadow of dark stubble dusted his skin. Richard's debts were not merely confined to gambling dens and tailors. He borrowed heavily against the unentailed family properties. I am restructuring the tenant leases to cover the deficit. Nora felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. My family's debts were a drop in the bucket. Alistair cut her off sharply. Do not flatter yourself, Nora. The Linfield debts were a fraction of the mess my brother left behind. It was a harsh thing to say, but he said it gently. He was deliberately minimizing her burden. Why did you let him do it? She asked. Alistair looked at the fire. Because he was the golden child. My father indulged him. When I inherited the title, the precedent was set. I attempted to rein him in. I failed. He turned his eyes back to her, stark and unblinking. I will not fail again. He wasn't just talking about the ledgers. Come by the fire, Alistair ordered, his tone shifting back to the commanding Duke. Your lips are blue. The seamstresses cannot finish soon enough. Nora moved to the hearth, sinking into the leather wingback chair opposite the desk. The heat radiated through her bones. She watched Alistair pick up his quill and resume his relentless, scratching work. He did not ask her to leave. He did not force conversation. They sat in silence for 2 hours. It was the most peaceful Nora had felt in months. A month passed. The bruising gossip of London felt like a distant nightmare, buffered by 200 miles of frozen dirt and the impenetrable stone walls of Ashbourne. Nora settled into a quiet, solitary rhythm. She did not see her husband often. Alistair was a phantom of duty. He rode out with his steward at dawn, regardless of the freezing rain. He spent his afternoons buried in his study, fighting a war of numbers and leases. They shared dinner at opposite ends of a long dining table, the conversation polite, sparse, and entirely functional. Yet his presence was everywhere. When Nora developed a slight, persistent cough, a jar of raw honey and a potent ginger tincture appeared on her bedside table without a word from the staff. When she mentioned offhand to Mrs. Croft that her reading chair was positioned poorly for the afternoon light, she returned from a walk to find the heavy furniture rearranged, a new reading lamp installed, and a plush footstool added. He never took credit. He never mentioned these things. He simply smoothed the rough edges of her life from the shadows. It was late November when the first true frost hit. The grounds of Ashbourne turned iron-hard and white. Nora had taken to exploring the outer boundaries of the estate, bundled in her new, heavy cloaks. Behind a crumbling stone wall near the abandoned East Gardens, she found it. An old, dilapidated glass house. The wrought-iron frame was rusted, and half the glass panes were shattered, letting in the biting wind. Dead, withered vines clung to the trellises like skeletal fingers. The raised dirt beds were frozen solid. But Nora saw the potential. She loved things that grew. She loved the quiet, methodical patience of coaxing life from the dirt. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic, performative society she had been raised to navigate. She found an old trowel in a corner shed and set to work. She couldn't fix the glass, but she could clear the rot. She spent 3 afternoons pulling dead vines, her breath misting in the freezing air, her hands stinging even through her thick leather gloves. It was exhausting, filthy work. It felt wonderful. On the 4th afternoon, the sky turned a violent, bruised purple. The wind picked up, howling through the broken panes of the glasshouse. Nora was wrestling with a particularly stubborn root of dead ivy when a shadow blocked the entrance. She gasped, dropping the trowel. Alistair stood in the doorway. He was wearing a heavy riding coat, his boots caked with freezing mud. He looked at her soiled skirts, her mud-streaked cheeks, and the pile of decaying plant matter at her feet. "What are you doing, Nora?" he asked. His voice was dangerously quiet over the howling wind. Nora lifted her chin. She suddenly felt very foolish. A duchess playing in the dirt. "I am clearing cupboards. It is a waste of a good glasshouse." Alistair stepped inside. The wind whipped his dark hair across his forehead. "It is freezing. The structure is unsound. You will catch your death out here." "I am fine. I am wearing the cloak you bought me." He didn't argue. He crossed the small space in 3 long strides, grasped her arm, and pulled her towards the door. "Inside, now." "Alistair, my tools." "Leave them." He marched her back to the manor just as the first heavy, violent flakes of snow began to fall. The storm hit with brutal speed, burying Ashbourne under a foot of snow by nightfall. Nora retreated to her suite, bathed, and changed into a thick wool dress. She felt a lingering sting of irritation. He had treated her like a foolish child. She sat by her fire, violently turning the pages of a book she wasn't reading. The next morning, the snow had stopped, leaving a blindingly white world in its wake. Nora went to the window, intending to assess the drifts. She stopped cold. Down in the east garden, a swarm of estate workers was swarming the ruined glasshouse. Scaffolding had been erected. Men were hauling large panes of pristine glass. From a newly installed chimney pipe at the rear of the structure, a steady plume of black coal smoke was rising into the crisp air. Nora stared. She turned and ran from her room, abandoning her shawl, hurrying down the stairs and through the halls until she reached the library. She threw the doors open. Alistair was at his desk. He looked up, his brows drawing together at her abrupt entrance. "You are fixing it," Nora breathed, her chest heaving. Alistair set his pen down. "It was an eyesore. An estate must be maintained. You put a furnace in it. Glasshouses require heat, Nora. That is the fundamental principle of their design." His voice was perfectly level, devoid of any emotion. Nora walked slowly across the room, stopping directly in front of his desk. "Why do you do that?" "Do what?" "Lie. Deflect." She slammed her palms flat against the polished mahogany, leaning over the desk. The sudden burst of temper surprised them both. "You buy me dresses I actually want to wear, and you blame the weather. You put the books I actually want to read by my bed, and you pretend it was coincidence. You rebuild a ruined greenhouse because I spent 3 days shivering in it, and you call it estate maintenance." Alistair stared at her, his jaw clenched tight. "Why, Alistair?" Nora demanded, her voice cracking. "Why did you marry me? Don't give me that nonsense about family pride. You could have paid off my family, bought my silence, and sent me to the country. You didn't have to bind yourself to me." The silence in the library was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Alistair stood up. He was a massive man, and his sudden proximity made Nora's breath catch. He walked around the desk. He didn't stop until he was mere inches from her. She had to tilt her head all the way back to meet his eyes. The flat, grey slate of his gaze was gone, replaced by something dark, turbulent, and violently intense. "You think I married you for duty?" Alistair said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, rough whisper. "Yes." He raised a hand. For a second, Nora thought he was going to push her away. Instead, his large, calloused fingers brushed a loose curl from her cheek, tucking it gently behind her ear. His touch was burning hot. "My brother," Alistair said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, "was a blind, arrogant fool. He saw a pretty ornament. I saw a woman who stood at an altar while 400 people waited for her to break, and she never lowered her chin." Nora's breath hitched. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "He did not deserve you," Alistair continued, his eyes dropping briefly to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "He never deserved you. I watched him ignore you for 6 months. I watched him dismiss your mind. I watched him force you into dresses that made you look like a child while you tried to talk to him about the world." He stepped closer. The scent of cedar and rain enveloped her. "I did not marry you for duty, Nora. I married you because the moment he ran, you were free, and I was not going to let anyone else have you." He didn't wait for her to respond. He didn't kiss her. He simply dropped his hand, turned and walked out of the library, leaving Nora trembling violently in the quiet room. December brought a brittle, biting cold, and, to Nora's absolute horror, uninvited guests. The roads had momentarily cleared, long enough for a carriage to make the treacherous trek up the long drive. Nora was in the newly repaired, perfectly heated glass house, carefully repotting a fragile winter hellebore, when a footman found her. "Your Grace, Lord and Lady Hastings have arrived. The Duke has requested your presence in the drawing room." Nora's stomach plummeted. Lord Hastings was a distant cousin of Alistair's mother, a pompous man with a penchant for bad investments. His wife, Lady Hastings, was the most vicious gossip in the northern counties. Nora washed her hands, smoothed the skirts of her dark navy wool gown, and prepared for battle. She knew exactly why they were here. They wanted to inspect the damaged goods. They wanted to see the jilted bride who had been passed off to the older brother like an unwanted horse. She walked into the drawing room with her spine perfectly straight. Alistair was standing by the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked murderous. Lord Hastings was sitting on the sofa, looking thoroughly intimidated. Lady Hastings, however, sat with the posture of a predator scenting blood. "Ah, the Duchess!" Lady Hastings chirped as Nora entered. Her eyes immediately raked over Nora's simple, unadorned gown, finding it entirely lacking. "We were just telling Alistair how surprised we were by the sudden change in nuptials." Nora offered a tight, polite smile, taking a seat beside her husband. "Life is full of surprises, Lady Hastings." "Indeed." The older woman sipped her tea, her eyes glinting with malice. "Though one must admit it was terribly shocking. Poor Richard, he always was a restless soul, frightened by commitment, I suppose. And you, my dear, how terribly practical of you to simply swap brothers. Kept the title within reach, didn't you?" The insult was barely veiled. She was calling Nora an opportunistic whore. Lord Hastings choked on his tea. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth to reply, to defend herself with the polite, cutting rhetoric she had been taught in London. She never got the chance. The heavy crystal tumbler in Alistair's hand slammed down onto the marble mantelpiece with the force of a gunshot. The sharp crack echoed through the room. Silence instantly fell. Alistair turned slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell. He simply looked at Lady Hastings with a gaze so entirely devoid of humanity that the older woman visibly shrank back into the cushions. "You will address my wife with the respect her rank demands," Alistair said. His voice was a low, vibrating growl, like a predator warning off a scavenger. "Or you will not address her at all." Lady Hastings flushed an ugly, mottled red. "Alistair, please, we are family. I only meant to say that the circumstances were unconventional." "The circumstances," Alistair interrupted, his tone lethal, "are that my brother proved himself a coward. He forfeited his honor and his place in this family. Nora is the Duchess of Westmore. She is the mistress of this house. You sit in her drawing room, drinking her tea, seeking entertainment from a situation you lack the intellect to understand." Lord Hastings stood up, his hands shaking. "Now see here, Westmore, there is no need to insult my wife." "I did not insult her, Hastings. I stated a fact." Alistair's eyes flicked to the Lord. "You came here hoping to find a fractured household to feed your gossip. You found a united one. I suggest you order your carriage." "We have travelled for hours," Lady Hastings sputtered, abandoning all pretense of manners. "You cannot turn us out into the cold." "Mrs. Croft will provide you with blankets for the journey," Alistair replied coldly. Get out! It was an absolute, devastating social execution. To kick a guest out before dinner was an unforgivable breach of etiquette. Alistair did not care. He stood by the fire, immovable, until the Hastings practically fled the room, their faces pale with outrage and humiliation. The heavy double doors clicked shut behind them. The silence that followed was charged. Nora sat on the sofa, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent her entire life in a society where men fought with veiled insults and passive-aggressive snubs. She had never seen a man wield his power so bluntly, so protectively on her behalf. Richard would have laughed off Lady Hastings' insult. He would have told Nora she was being too sensitive. Alistair had just thrown his own family into the snow for disrespecting her. Alistair picked up his glass from the mantel. He stared into the amber liquid, his knuckles white. The terrifying violence in his posture had not entirely dissipated. Nora stood up. She walked over to him, her soft footsteps muffled by the thick rug. She stopped beside him. She didn't say, "Thank you." Thank you felt incredibly inadequate. Instead, she reached out. Her small, pale hand tentatively touched his forearm, resting against the dark wool of his sleeve. Alistair went utterly still. He looked down at her hand, and then up at her face. The tension slowly, incrementally, began to drain from his shoulders. "I am not a fragile thing, Alistair," Nora said softly. "I could have managed her." "I know you could have," he replied, his voice rough. "But you should not have to." He turned toward her fully. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he raised his hand and covered hers, lacing his fingers through hers. His palm was warm, solid. "No one disrespects you in my house," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, holding her gaze with that terrifying, unwavering intensity. "No one. You are mine." It wasn't a statement of ownership, it was a vow. Nora looked up at the cold, unyielding Duke of Westmore, the man who had bought her family's debt and claimed her at the altar. She felt the heavy gold ring on her finger. It no longer felt like a shackle. It felt like an anchor. "I know," Nora whispered. For the first time since he had stepped out of that pew and offered his hand, Alistair's hard mouth softened. He didn't smile. Not quite, but the rigid lines of his face eased, and he squeezed her hand gently. The storm raged outside the heavy stone walls of Ashbourne, but as Nora stood by the fire, entirely enveloped in the fierce, quiet protection of her husband, she had never felt warmer. January brought a brutal, unrelenting freeze that locked Ashbourne in a fortress of ice. The moors turned to jagged, frozen tundra. The estate retreated inward, surviving on the stockpiles of coal and root vegetables Alistair had meticulously audited in the autumn. Inside the manor, a strange, quiet domesticity had taken root. Nora no longer felt like a guest. She gave orders to the kitchens. She audited the pantry ledgers. She spent her afternoons in the glasshouse, reading by the iron stove while her hellebores pushed stubborn green shoots through the warmed earth. And she watched her husband. They had not spoken of the confrontation in the library, nor the expulsion of the Hastings. Alistair had simply reverted to his quiet, relentless routine. Yet a subtle shift had occurred. He lingered longer over breakfast. When they sat in the library in the evenings, he no longer hid entirely behind his paperwork. He would occasionally read aloud a passage from a political journal, genuinely asking for her opinion. He listened when she spoke. He never interrupted. It was a terrifying, quiet sort of intimacy. Nora realized, with a slow, creeping dread, that she was falling deeply, irrevocably in love with a man who guarded his heart behind an iron vault. The fragile peace shattered on a Tuesday. The post-rider managed to navigate the icy roads, bringing the first mail from London in weeks. Nora was in the study, organizing a stack of seed catalogues, when Alistair walked in. He held a small silver tray. On it rested a single, crumpled letter. It bore a French postmark. Nora froze. The air in the room seemed to evaporate. She knew the messy, looping scrawl on the parchment. She had spent a year reading sonnets written in that exact handwriting. Richard. Alistair set the tray down on her desk. His face was a mask of carved stone. His jaw was locked so tightly a muscle ticked furiously beneath his ear. It arrived with the Morning Post. Alistair said. His voice was entirely devoid of inflection. It is addressed to you. He didn't hover. He didn't demand to read it. He simply turned his back, walking over to the window to stare out at the frozen grounds, giving her the privacy to read words from the man who had broken her. Nora stared at the letter. 6 months ago, she would have torn it open with shaking hands. She would have wept. She would have begged for an explanation. Now she felt nothing but a cold, heavy fatigue. Slowly she picked it up. She broke the wax seal. The letter was a masterpiece of narcissistic self-pity. Richard wrote of the dreary weather in Paris. He complained that his funds were running low because their father's solicitors had cut him off. He wrote, in a flowery, dramatic paragraph, that he missed her smile, that he had made a terrible mistake fueled by the panic of youth, and that he hoped she could find it in her heart to forgive him. He casually mentioned that a small loan, sent discreetly to his current inn, would greatly assist his return to England so he could make amends. He didn't even know she had married his brother. He clearly hadn't read the London papers. He thought she was still the pathetic, ruined girl he had left crying at the altar, waiting for him to whistle. Nora read the letter twice. A slow, dark anger began to simmer in her chest, replacing the fatigue. She looked up at Alistair. His broad back was rigid. He was bracing himself. He was waiting for her to shatter. He was waiting for proof that she still loved the golden brother. Nora stood up. The heavy wool of her dark green dress rustled loudly in the quiet room. She walked past her desk, past the sofa, and directly to the roaring fireplace. Without a word, she tossed the parchment onto the burning logs. Alistair turned from the window at the sudden movement. He watched the flames lick the edges of the paper, curling the parchment, turning Richard's desperate, manipulative words into black ash. Nora watched it burn until there was nothing left. Then she turned to face her husband. He asked for money. Nora said, her voice flat, utterly unimpressed. He is in Paris, and he is broke. Alistair stared at the ashes, then slowly raised his eyes to hers. The storm brewing in his grey eyes was complex, disbelief fighting a sudden, fierce rush of relief. You did not read it all. He could have what? Nora interrupted, stepping toward him. Apologized? Begged for my heart? She let out a sharp, cynical laugh. He doesn't want my heart, Alistair. He wants my purse. He is a coward and a parasite. He always was. I was just too desperate for a way out of my father's house to see it. She closed the distance between them. Alistair stood perfectly still, his chest rising and falling heavily. I do not care about him, Nora said, her voice dropping to a fierce, steady whisper. She looked directly into his eyes, refusing to let him look away. I care about the man who stayed. I care about the man who stood in front of a church and shielded me from the world. Alistair sucked in a harsh breath. He reached out, his large hands gripping her shoulders, pulling her against his chest. It was a sudden, almost desperate movement. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot against her skin. "I would have killed him," Alistair rasped, the confession torn from his throat. "If he had come back to claim you, I would have killed my own brother." Nora wrapped her arms around his waist, holding him fiercely. He was trembling. The immovable Duke, the man of ice and ledgers, was shaking in her arms. "He cannot claim what is not his," Nora whispered against his collar. "I am exactly where I choose to be." February was cruel. The ice gave way to a relentless, driving sleet that turned the roads to a treacherous, freezing mud. Disaster struck the estate on a Friday night. A heavy accumulation of freezing rain collapsed the thatched roof of a tenant cottage on the far western border. A family of 5 was trapped beneath the heavy, soaked timber. The news reached the manor at midnight. Alistair did not hesitate. He dressed in the dark, pulling on his heaviest boots and riding leathers. He did not wake the head groom. He saddled his black gelding himself and rode out into the pitch-black, freezing storm with an axe tied to his saddle. Nora woke to the sound of frantic shouting in the courtyard. She found Mrs. Croft in the kitchen, organizing a team of maids to boil water and tear old linens for bandages. "The Duke has gone to the western boundary, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her usually stoic face tight with worry. "The roof at the Miller cottage caved in. It is miles away. The mud is too thick for a wagon. He took his horse." Nora's stomach plummeted. "How long ago?" 3 hours. Nora took control. She did not panic. She channeled the ruthless efficiency she had learned from watching her husband. She ordered the guest rooms heated. She sent a rider to the village to fetch Dr. Finch, threatening the man with dismissal if he refused to ride in the dark. She organized a makeshift infirmary in the drawing room, closest to the fires. Dawn broke, grey and miserable, before the sound of exhausted horses echoed in the courtyard. Nora ran to the door. Alistair was walking through the sleet, carrying a young boy wrapped in his own heavy wool cloak. Alistair was soaked to the bone. His white shirt was plastered to his skin, streaked with mud and blood. His face was a ghastly pale grey, his lips entirely blue. He handed the boy to Mrs. Croft, issued 3 rapid, breathless orders regarding the rest of the Miller family who were arriving on foot behind him, and then he simply collapsed. He didn't stumble. He went down hard, his massive frame hitting the stone floor of the foyer with a sickening thud. "Alistair!" Nora screamed, dropping to her knees on the wet stone. He was unconscious. His skin was freezing, yet a terrible, unnatural heat was already radiating from his neck. The next 48 hours were a blur of absolute terror. Dr. Finch diagnosed it as severe pneumonia, brought on by extreme exhaustion and cold exposure. The doctor bled him, applied foul-smelling mustard poultices to his chest, and murmured grave, useless platitudes about waiting for the crisis to pass. Nora banished the doctor to the guest wing. She banished the maids. She took off her velvet overdress, rolled up the sleeves of her linen chemise, and went to war. She did not leave Alistair's side. He thrashed in the massive bed, burning with a violent fever. In his delirium, he muttered about ledgers, about Richard, about the heavy snow. He fought the blankets, his immense strength making it nearly impossible for Nora to keep him covered. "Stay with me," Nora pleaded, her voice raw, as she pressed another cold, wet cloth to his burning forehead. "You do not get to leave me. Do you hear me? You promised you would not tolerate a public spectacle, Alistair. A widow's weeds are a terrible spectacle." He didn't hear her. His breathing was a wet, ragged rattle. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. Nora was asleep in the chair pulled close to the bed, her head resting on the mattress, her hand gripping his entirely limp fingers. A weak, rough pressure squeezed her hand. Nora jerked awake. The room was dark, lit only by the dying embers of the fire. Alistair's eyes were open. They were bloodshot, sunken deep into his skull, and he looked like he had aged 10 years. But the feverish glaze was gone. He looked at her. He looked at her tangled hair, the dark, bruising circles under her eyes and her ruined linen sleeves. "You look terrible," he rasped. His voice was barely a croak, broken and dry. Nora let out a jagged sob. She didn't care about dignity. She didn't care about propriety. She threw herself forward, burying her face in the crook of his neck, her tears soaking his fever-damp shirt. Alistair groaned slightly at the impact, but his heavy arm lifted, wrapping around her back, pulling her close. His hand tangled in her messy hair. "I am here," he whispered weakly, pressing a dry kiss to the top of her head. "I am here, Nora. I am not going anywhere." "You are an idiot," she cried into his chest. "You are a reckless, stupid man. I saved the tenants. You almost killed my husband." He went still. The silence stretched, heavy and profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and his somewhat labored breathing. "Say that again," Alistair commanded softly. Nora lifted her head. She looked down into his exhausted, sharp face. She reached up, her thumb tracing the heavy line of his jaw, feeling the harsh scratch of his dark stubble. "You almost killed my husband," she repeated, her voice steadying. "And I refuse to let him go. I love him too much to let him die of stubbornness." Alistair's eyes closed. A single, silent tear leaked from the corner of his eye, tracking through the dirt and sweat still clinging to his cheek. It was the only time Nora would ever see him cry. He pulled her down, finding her lips in the dark. It wasn't a demanding kiss. It was desperate, salty, and utterly broken. It was the kiss of a man who had spent his entire life carrying the world, finally realizing he had someone to share the weight. Spring did not arrive at Ashbourne with a gentle whisper. It arrived with a violent, sudden melt. The ice shattered. The rivers swelled. The grey moors exploded into a vibrant, blinding green. Alistair's recovery was slow, infuriating his relentless nature. For 3 weeks, Nora ruled the estate with an iron fist, managing the stewards, signing the ledgers, and forcing her husband to stay in bed. She was ruthless. Alistair found it entirely intoxicating. By late April, he was finally permitted to leave the manor. Nora found him in the glass house. The structure was unrecognizable from the ruined shell she had discovered in November. The glass sparkled in the afternoon sun. The air inside was thick, humid, and bursting with the smell of damp earth and life. The beds were overflowing with winter hellebores, early primroses, and creeping ivy. Alistair stood in the center of the walkway. He was no longer wearing his severe black coats. He wore a simple linen shirt, open at the collar, and riding breeches. The brutal hollows of his illness had filled out, and the sun caught the dark, rich strands of his hair. He was looking at a single, perfect white rose blooming from a pot on the iron table. Nora walked up behind him. She slipped her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against the broad, solid expanse of his back. He immediately leaned back into her touch, covering her hands with his. The heavy gold signet ring still hung loose on her thumb, but she had wrapped a piece of thick green thread around the back to make it fit tighter. She refused to take it off. "It survived the frost," Alistair said, his voice a low rumble vibrating through his chest. "I kept the furnace burning," Nora replied softly. He turned around in her arms. He looked down at her. The cold, unreadable duke she had married at the altar was gone. In his place was a man who looked at her with a fierce, possessive, unyielding devotion. "You kept everything burning," Alistair said. He reached into his pocket. "I have something for you. I sent for it weeks ago before the storm. It just arrived from London." He pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. That was not who he was. He simply opened it, his large hands dwarfing the delicate casing. Inside sat a wedding band. It wasn't a massive, gaudy diamond meant to show off the Westmore wealth. It was a thick band of braided gold, intertwined with deep green emeralds, specifically cut to sit flush against the skin so it would not catch on thorns or dirt when she worked in her garden. It was perfect. It was observant. It was him. Your brother's ring was an insult, Alistair said, his voice dropping to that rough, intimate register. And my signet is a burden. You deserve a ring chosen entirely for you, by a man who actually sees you. Nora's breath hitched. She looked from the ring to his face. Alistair, I cannot give you poetry, Nora, he said, his eyes intensely focused on hers. I am not a charming man. I will likely spend too many hours in the library, and I will always hate London society. But I swear to you, on my life, my title, and my honor, I will never leave you behind. Nora smiled. It was a brilliant, genuine smile that reached her eyes, chasing away the last shadows of the jilted girl she had been. I don't want poetry, she said, stepping closer, closing the final inch of space between them. I want you. She held out her left hand. Alistair gently took her hand. He didn't remove his signet ring from her thumb. He simply slid the new band of gold and emeralds onto her ring finger. It fit flawlessly. He pulled her up against his chest. When he kissed her this time, there was no desperation, no fever, no shadow of the past. It was deep, claiming, and entirely real. The air in the glass house was hot and still, trapping them in a world entirely of their own making. Nora melted into him, her hands tangling in his dark hair, the cool metal of the new ring pressing against his neck. She had been dragged to the altar in ruin, discarded by a boy who only wanted a pretty reflection. But she had walked away with a king, a cold, ruthless king who had slowly, quietly built a fortress around her heart and set the whole world on fire just to keep her warm. Did you love watching the cold Duke finally melt for the woman he saved? There is nothing quite like a ruthless man who only has a soft spot for his wife. If Nora and Alistair's quiet, fiercely protective love story made your heart race, please hit that like button and share this video with your fellow romance lovers. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new historical drama. Drop a comment below. Would you have chosen the Golden Brother or the Dark Duke? See you in the next story.